With its picturesque, heavy snow-capped mountains, endlessly dark cedar forests, and ancient, forgotten shrines, it is no surprise that the northern regions of Japan have served as the eerie backdrop for some of history's most iconic and terrifying folklore. The landscape itself feels heavy with ancient, unspoken secrets. Drawing on the incredibly rich and blood-soaked myths of their native land, ancient scholars and terrified villagers brought to life timeless stories of vengeful spirits, wandering yokai, and terrible monsters that lurked just beyond the firelight. These were not just stories, but survival guides for the dark. Such terrifying legends were born out of a brutal time when menacing wild beasts took on public personas as being the literal reincarnation of evil men. The line between a savage animal and a demonic entity was completely erased in the minds of those who lived near the treacherous tree lines. History whispers of a wild, monstrous dog that violently terrified the people of Old Edo. The attacks only stopped when the villagers managed to capture the beast, dressed it mockingly in a Buddhist monk's robes, and hanged it from a dead tree like a common human criminal to cleanse the curse. It is no surprise, then, that in many local tales, the ultimate malevolent force often comes in the physical form of a devious, calculating beast. To better aid in its deceptive and bloody ways, the creature will patiently mask its evil intentions, waiting for the perfect moment to strike the isolated. Most interestingly, these entities utilize the dark art of shape-shifting to completely assume the form of a normal man. They walk among the villagers, hiding their ungodly nature behind a stolen human face, feeding on the paranoia and eventual flesh of their unsuspecting neighbors. Image prompt spreads across the page like a dark ghost story. There is a figure crouching in the mud, their spine snapping and elongating unnaturally. Flesh is actively tearing to reveal dark fur underneath, agonizing, twisted body horror, hand-drawn, dark graphic novel illustration, detailed ink and charcoal sketch, heavy cross-hatching technique, vivid emotional expression, muted monochromatic tones with dominant deep red and blood crimson overlay. Why, then, do the following classified accounts from military-aged men serving in various remote regions of Japan over the last 2 decades seem to cast a chilling doubt on that comfortable presumption? Modern weapons and strict discipline offer absolutely no protection against the impossible. To the contrary, these hardened men of the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force insist they saw something in the tree line that terrified them
completely out of their wits. They speak in hushed, trembling voices of encounters that completely shattered their understanding of reality and nature.
Because the ungodly creatures they saw vary so wildly in appearance, modern researchers might call them shapeshifters. But the indigenous Ainu people of the Northern Territories might call them by a much older, darker name. In essence, it is the equivalent of the terrifying American Skinwalker.
The year was 1998. The deep winter had buried the Aomori military training camp in suffocating snow. It was a smoke pit, the absolute edge of civilization. And these are the true, classified accounts of shapeshifters actively stalking the frozen perimeters of the Japanese military.
Recruit Kenji stood at attention in the freezing corridor. The base had been experiencing severe, unexplainable technical problems with the electric grid all afternoon. It was highly uncommon, considering the heavy machinery had just been fully inspected by engineers only days earlier.
Sergeant Sato approached, his face a mask of strict military annoyance. Recruit Kenji, how did the repairs go? Did you manage to get the backup generators fixed? Sato demanded, his voice echoing harshly in the dim, failing light of the subterranean barracks hall.
Negative, Sergeant. Perhaps you need to come down to the basement and see this for yourself. The main generator has been heavily damaged, Kenji replied, his voice trembling noticeably despite his training. His eyes darted nervously back toward the stairwell, leading down into the dark.
Damaged by what? Sato barked angrily. I am not sure, Sergeant. It looks like it was violently slashed open. Maybe a massive bear or something from the woods, Kenji stuttered, his mind unable to logically process the sheer scale of the destruction he had just witnessed. The sergeant grabbed a flashlight and pushed past Kenji. They descended into the freezing basement where the generators were housed. The third generator, the largest main source of power, was completely destroyed. The first thing Sato noticed were the massive, impossible scratches.
This seemingly indestructible, super hard hunk of industrial metal had deep, violent cuts piercing its outer shell. They were massive claw marks cutting through the solid steel like a buzzsaw. The scratches were so incredibly deep they had severed the internal cords and destroyed the batteries as if they were wet paper.
After a long moment of stunned silence, Kenji spoke up. "Sergeant, nothing any recruit has on this base could cut through that tough metal so easily. This couldn't have been a person doing this."
The realization hung in the freezing air, heavy and suffocating.
Sato finally blinked, trying to reassert his authority over the creeping dread. Well, the most we can do is tell base command. Put an armed guard on the basement door and have the engineers replace the unit. Good thing reporting this, Kenji. Now get back to your training.
Kenji was formally commended for his report and told to resume his daily drills. Still, the forced nonchalance displayed by his sergeant did absolutely nothing to quell the young soldier's rising panic. At best, there was a violent sedateur running amok on their base. At worst, he didn't want to think about it.
As the sun set behind the brutal mountains and the freezing recruits finally retired to their bunks, Kenji drifted off into an incredibly uneasy, restless sleep. Sleeping in a large, open squad bay with a cold concrete floor, the atmosphere was usually noisy, but tonight it felt dead and heavy.
Some hours later, completely in the dead of the pitch-black night, Kenji was abruptly, violently awakened. He couldn't be exactly sure of the time. He heard a sickening, wet, scratching noise. It wasn't coming from the basement. It was way too close and way too loud.
The horrible, metallic scraping sound was echoing directly inside the sleeping quarters. After a horrific moment of realization, Kenji slowly turned his head. He looked around the dark room and saw what he initially thought was a fellow soldier crouched in the far corner, digging through a heavy canvas duffel bag.
Kenji rubbed his tired eyes, trying to make sense of the gloom. But when he cautiously looked around at the rest of the room, sheer, unadulterated terror violently crashed into him. He quickly counted the sleeping bodies. Every single bunk was currently occupied. Everyone was in their bed. So Kenji thought to himself, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Wait, who the hell is that in the corner? A paralyzing cold washed over his entire body, freezing the blood in his veins.
Then, as if the monstrous entity had literally heard what he was thinking, the thing in the corner completely stopped moving. The scratching ceased. Slowly, with an unnatural, sickening series of bone-popping jerks, the tall figure turned its grotesque head to directly face Kenji. The emergency red light caught its face. It was completely pale gray, like the skin of a 3-day-old drowned corpse. It had absolutely no nose, just two dark jagged slits, and a wide, unnatural mouth. It was not human. It was an abomination, wrapped in an ill-fitting human shape. The creature slowly raised its hands, extending from its disproportionately long skeletal fingers were massive, metallic-looking claws, sharp as surgical razors. These were the exact same weapons that had shredded the solid steel generator just hours before. They clicked together in the dark. The thing slowly stood up, its joints popping loudly in the silent room. It was incredibly skinny, looking starved and ancient. As it reached its full height, it towered easily 2 feet taller than any 6-foot man in the platoon, its head almost brushing the ceiling of the barracks. After witnessing that impossible height, Kenji completely lost control of his body. He just froze, trapped in a blank, unblinking stare of absolute horror. He couldn't scream, he couldn't run, he couldn't even breathe. He was completely at the mercy of the shapeshifter. The entity just stood there, staring deep into Kenji's soul with hollow, hungry eyes. In the young soldier's terrified mind, seconds painfully stretched into minutes. Minutes dragged into hours, and hours turned into what felt like an agonizing eternity of psychological torture. The overwhelming pressure of the demonic presence was too much for a human heart to bear. Ultimately, Kenji's brain initiated a desperate fail-safe to protect his sanity. His vision tunneled into blackness, and he forcefully passed out in pure, undiluted terror.